right. Thank you all very much. I am both impressed and incredibly delighted with the turnout. This large room is almost entirely packed. I hope nobody is planning to call the fire marshal, because we might be very close to our capacity. I love it when we have these interesting, timely topics with phenomenal researchers and speakers who are experts in their field of study with a deep understanding of the subject matter coming to Stevens and attracting members of our community. So without further ado, and in order to maximize the amount of time that I give our distinguished speaker, I'd like to welcome all of you, all faculty, staff, hundreds of students, many alumni, and other friends of the university for joining us for this presentation that I am sure will be a spectacular one by Dr. Darío Gil, as he shares with us his reflections on the future of computing and its profound implications on the future of science and business and society and life. As many of you know, because I see a lot of regulars in the audience, for more than a decade, the President's Distinguished Lecture Series has created a platform at Stevens for some of the most influential scientists, technologists, policymakers, and business leaders of our time to discuss topics that range from science and technology policy to national security to future energy systems and even cancer research. Past talks have included directors of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the former chairman of Intel, the director of research at Google, a Nobel Prize winner who led the National Cancer Institute, among others. These talks have elucidated our knowledge of technological advancements that are shaping the 21st century, and certainly they have helped tremendously in creating the kind of intellectual climate that we're trying to promote at Stevens. Today, for the 17th installment of the President Distinguished Lecture Series, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Darío Gil, IBM's Senior Vice President and Director of Research, to share his insights on computing technologies such as generative AI and quantum computing, and how these are accelerating the rate of scientific discovery and community innovation. Dr. Gil is responsible for IBM Research, one of the world's largest and most influential corporate research laboratories. He directs innovation strategies in hybrid cloud, AI, semiconductors, quantum computing, and exploratory science. He heads the technical community of IBM and is responsible for the company's intellectual property, strategy, and business. Dr. Gil is also chair of the National Science Board, which oversees the National Science Foundation. An advocate of collaborative research models, he co-chairs the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab, which advances fundamental AI research to benefit industry and society. He also co-chairs the executive board of the International Science Reserve, a global network of open scientific communities that provide specialized resources to prepare for and help mitigate urgent, complex global challenges. He has served on the U.S. President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and is a member of the President's Research Council of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He's also on the MIT School of Engineering Dean's Advisory Council and the Aspen Global Cybersecurity Group. I don't know where you find the time to do all of the things that you do. He serves on the boards of the Semiconductor Industry Association, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the New York Academy of Sciences, the New York Hall of Science, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Do you sleep at all? Dr. Gill is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and he received a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from where? Stevens Institute of Technology, and a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. Without further ado, please join me in giving him a gigantic round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you, President Farvardin, for the wonderful introduction, and apologies for the length of it. So I am delighted that we're going to get the opportunity to explore what's next in computing. Following my talk, also, we'll have an opportunity to take some questions, right? So as we go along, think about it. What are the things that interest you? Now, since we're in beautiful Stevens campus, I want to share you also where I work, which is another beautiful place. This is the research headquarters of IBM. It's about an hour north of the city. It's in Yorktown Heights. It's a beautiful building that was designed by Eero Saarinen, and it opened in 1961. Now, next year, IBM Research will celebrate its 80th anniversary as a research division, and IBM, of course, has been doing information technology and computing for over 110 years, right? And I say this because part of the ability to navigate a famously disruptive industry like the world of information technology and computing for over a century requires sustained commitments to research and development. A commitment to be able to navigate, right, that changing landscape by bringing scientists and engineers who are always looking at the future. And it is the great privilege that I have to lead IBM Research, which has over 3,000 scientists and engineers of a wide variety of disciplines. We have everything from mathematicians and physicists and material scientists and chemists and engineers of every type. Who have made over the decades very fundamental contributions to the fields of science. There's been 6 IBMers who have been awarded the Nobel Prize, and many, many important seminal contributions to both IBM and to the industry at large. And it gives you a little bit of a visual travel tour. We have locations in many places around the world. I'll show you the headquarters. We have a laboratory that we have jointly with MIT focused on AI. You see Almaden, which is a beautiful facility south of San Jose in California. In Albany, where we do a lot of advanced semiconductor work. It's a 300 millimeter facility. It's a fantastic place in Zurich, in Rushlikon, and et cetera. So many facilities around the world that we take advantage of global talent to work on a common purpose. And our common purpose is to create what's next in computing. And I want to tell you about what's unfolding in the world of computing. And I want to preface by saying that I actually think, I was talking to, I had a roundtable with some students today, Stevens students, and I was saying that this is the most exciting time in computing, probably since the 1940s. And I go all the way back to the 1940s because that was the time where the first programmable computers were created. That was the time where the transistor was invented. And around that time, notions like information theory had been developed and created. So basically, they were all the building blocks that allowed the creation of the information technology and the computing industry and the communications industry for many decades to come. And we've all seen the impact that that has had. Well, in this decade and at this time, I think it's an equally exciting time. And simply put, the way I've organized my remarks to share with you is to remember that the future of computing is this idea of bits, neurons, and qubits. And I'm going to unpack what I mean by saying that. But it's a way to remember there is actually 3 fundamental things going on that we got to connect the dots of how they are going to intersect. So let me begin by casting this journey of bits, neurons, and qubits and what it means by revisiting and going back to the fundamental of understanding what is information itself. And where are some of these powerful ideas that are reshaping our life coming from? And I will trace back the story of the digital, the story of the representation of information to Leibniz. And Leibniz, who, of course, very famous philosopher, co-inventor of calculus, along with Newton, right, that they developed independently, was fascinated by the idea of that one could encode all the knowledge in the world into a binary representation. In Latin, he said, to create everything out of nothing, one is sufficient. The idea of the 0 and the 1. And the idea that if you could do that, then you could apply all the tools of mathematics and so on to actually manipulate and process that information. He didn't yet know how to do that in the form of like computers and so on, but the intellectual origin and the idea that you could take all the knowledge of the world, represent it in a binary format, and then reason over that using the tools of mathematics goes back to Leibniz. It was Claude Shannon, over 200 years later, that took those ideas and formalized it into something that is now known as information theory. And he told us that information is the resolution of uncertainty. And it was through information theory that we change how we look and understand the world. Because in this binary representation, this idea of the bit, the binary digit, all of a sudden we came to understand that objects as different as an old punch card or DNA that look so different are all carriers of information. And that we can actually use information theory to understand how information is stored, processed, communicated, etc. It's a really fundamental idea. Once we had that building block, then there was a companion technology that made it scale in a way that utterly transformed every aspect of our society. And that was that once we have this binary digit, that bit, we could encode a bit in a transistor. There are other ways to do it. It's a switch. You could, obviously, we did that before with vacuum tubes and so on. But there was a fundamental difference in being able to encode it with a transistor. And that is that and the combination of the planar process allowed us to integrate more and more transistors per unit area as a function of time, driven by lithography and other processes. And as a consequence of that, we essentially have made bits free, almost. There's been this exponential growth, driven by technology, driven by generation after generation of scientists and technologies, and trillions of dollars of investment in R&D and manufacturing capacity, that if you plot over time the number of transistors that we can integrate per unit area, by the end of this decade, we will be able to put 1 trillion transistors in a chip the size of a fingernail. Think about that. 1 trillion transistors. And that is the consequence of a massive amount of talent in terms of development of material sciences processes, new device architectures, lithography, as I mentioned, and equipment processing, innovations around architectures. But I want to keep you that in mind, because we're going to combine that idea. So this is how I'm briefly summarizing this world of bits, of how many units of digital representation can we encode, and how much can we further scale it. Today, to give you a sense, we routinely integrate tens of billions of transistors in a chip. But it is one of the challenges always with us, since we perceive time, obviously linearly, to deal with exponentials. And the last doubling of an exponential is when the world comes up and says, what happened? What happened in the last 2 years? What happened in the last 4 years? And this is just one of the trends that is going to happen. So I want to tell you about the second trend, which is topic du jour, right, in our society, the world of AI. And if I trace the idea of bits to Leibniz and Claude Shannon after, I want to trace the idea of neurons to another scientist, Santiago Ramón y Cajal. And he was one of the pioneers of now known as the field of neuroscience, and was among the first to understand that in our brains we have this cell structure called neurons, and that neurons have these long tails called axons, and that when axons meet one another they form synapses, and that structure is deeply connected to memory and learning. He was, by the way, a wonderful illustrator too. He has this, if you look at online, he would do all these hand diagrams, like looking under the microscope of all this catalog of cells, of neurons that he was observing under the microscope. Well, it wasn't with a lot more than that biological inspiration that in the 1940s, mathematicians started generating an abstraction of that idea. And that's when the idea of artificial neural networks emerged. And we began to see diagrams like this, where each dot represents a neuron. Neurons are organized in layers, right? And the connection between neurons, represented by these lines, are the synapses, quote unquote. And the process of learning, by example, that is at the heart of machine learning and this world of neural networks, is the process of showing an example. Let's say you want to be able to classify what's a cat, and you want the neural network to learn what is a cat. It is the process of iteratively changing the weights of the connections between neurons, the synapses, such that once you go through this whole process, an output neuron will only fire if a cat goes into the input, and never if there's no cat as an input. So it was this loose biological inspiration that allowed to create a learning framework of learning by example that was the origin of neural networks. Well, fast forward many decades, and now we get to the world with many other advancements, including ones that has been recognized just this week with the Nobel Prize as well in physics, around how now in modern days we create large language models or foundation models, and our ability to encode extraordinary amounts of data and information in a shared representation inside a neural network. So how does that happen? The way that happens is through a clever trick. And basically, you can take all the knowledge in the world, like let's say documents, or you can take code or images, and you basically tokenize them. That means you just break them into little chunks, subsets of words or subsets of code, and each chunk gets vectorized. You make it into a vector, back to the Leibniz idea, right? So, but this expresses a vector, and once you have everything encoded as vectors, you pass these vectors sequentially through a very large-scale neural network in such a way that you're iteratively changing those weights in the neural network, grossly simplifying the overall story, but nonetheless reasonably accurate, such that in the end, all of that data that you've chunked up vectorized ends up being encoded inside the neural network. The beauty of that is that this process can be automated. You don't have to organize in your head how all the data is connected to one another. The network itself has sufficiently large degrees of freedom, parameters as it's called. You can have tens of billions, hundreds of billions, even 1 trillion parameters, and you can have tens of billions and trillions of tokens as well. It's actually many trillions of tokens that you can put inside. And that allows you to actually accomplish a few things. Scale, many terabytes of data can go into it. Multimodality, you can have many forms of knowledge representation being encoded into it. But what the most powerful aspect is, once it happens and it's inside, you can establish semantic connections between very disparate data that prior to that was unconnected. Prior to that, it existed in different documents, in different forms. But once it's inside this large-scale network, it is actually allowed you to connect it to one another. The consequence of that is actually quite profound, because it turns out that then you can create these models and not only use it to make these connections, but you can use it to generate output after you have that data representation inside the network, hence the whole world of generative AI. And you can use it for language. By the way, once you actually look at this, and if you squint, everything looks like a language. The clicks on a screen is a language that a user is talking to you by showing what their interest is. Or tabular data can be interpreted as a language. Code, of course, is language. Programming languages, in fact, we call them. And chemistry and materials, of course, there's a language with which to describe the chemical interactions and the diagrammatic representations of materials. So you can do this for almost anything, applying this general technique. In fact, just to give an obvious example, you can use these large language models to do all sorts of fantastic things like generating code, or translating code, or fixing code, or documented code, or explaining code, or engaging in mathematical reasoning, and so on. Now, many of these aspirations have been with us for a long time. I mean, synthetic, and automated programming have been part of the field of computer science for a long, long time, and there were, many efforts towards doing that. But it is the unlocked of the power of these new forms of representations at scale that is allowing us to solve this problem in a truly novel way. However, one of the challenges that we have ahead of us is that the energy consumption of these systems, it is completely sort of out of place. I mean, hopefully you're all sort of like following and reading this. I mean, now you're hearing about powering new power plant. Nuclear plants, to support like data centers, you name it. So we have a lot of work ahead of us as a community to radically lower the amount of energy consumption to deliver these functions. Now, at one extreme of the equation is us humans, right? Like we dissipate 20 watts, right? And we're not very good at calculation, right? But we are very good at many other things, and we possess, very sophisticated intelligence around that. But if you just look sort of like in a brute force fashion around this, and we continue going like it is, we quite literally would have to use all the energy production of the world just to power these data centers and so on, which is not going to happen. It's not a sensible thing to do, right? So I'm not advocating that that is the right thing. So there's a lot of work we got to do to create better engineered models that are more cost efficient and deliver their performance. And we need to radically rethink the architectures that we're using to power AI. And a few directions, that to sketch in here that are going to be important is, it is true that GPUs are better than CPUs in implementing large language models, because at the core of it is you're implementing sort of this matrix multiplication routine systematically. That does not mean that GPUs are the ideal platform for AI. It's just better than a CPU. So there's a lot of creativity and energy in academia, in the industry, in large, into having more specialized forms of chips and architectures to enable a future that's more sustainable for the world of AI. That involves having reduced precision architectures that are specialized for AI. Things like combining memory and compute together, so you can remove the von Neumann bottleneck of being like today, we got to shuffle. Part of the energy is shuffling the data back and forth between memory and the compute present in the GPU. And in the future, also analog AI, right? Novel approaches with which we implement this much more efficiently, like our brain, right? We're an example of that, of being able to do that. So another aspect that is very important in how we go about this journey is that we should build this technology and go on this journey of AI together as an open and diverse community around this. There's been many analogies that have been made, right, and ways to do comparisons on AI. Some have said, oh, AI is so powerful, they're like nuclear weapons and so on, and we should have them, restricted in how they get developed and used. I think that's totally the wrong framework around this. I think the best way we can ensure that we develop AI that is governed properly and shapes and reflects the needs of our society is to make it as open and as diverse in institutional participation as possible. It is for that reason that I led the effort of creating the AI Alliance. We did it in partnership with Meta. It began with a dialogue with Jan LeCun and others, and we created an alliance focused on the development of AI with a principle of open innovation and collaboration. And we brought together many of the world-leading universities and science foundations, as well as national laboratories, small companies, large companies, and also in an international dimension, to work together on a whole variety of topics, from how to enable diverse hardware that is more energy efficient for the future, to a whole variety of foundation models that represent the fields of science, right, and technology more broadly. So for example, we have a wonderful collaboration with NASA to create geospatial models, right, based on the new technology, et cetera, as well as novel testing and benchmarking mechanisms to enable trust in the development of AI. So this is one thing that I would encourage you to look up and participate, but I think it's a very important element of developing AI that reflects the need of society by representing a broad, diverse set of institutions that actually bring their expertise and their knowledge to guide it towards a good outcome. So I want to talk now at the third element. I told you about 1 trillion transistors in a chip by the end of the decade. I told you about now the scale of the neural networks that can be created to basically represent almost all the knowledge and information in the world in novel ways. And I want to tell you about the third element and spend a little bit of time of this computing revolution that we're witnessing, the world of qubits. For us at IBM, the journey began in the 1960s and 1970s. And I told you about Shannon. And Shannon famously separated the idea of information from the world of physics. He said, no, those are totally different things. This idea of bits, they're almost like this Platonic idea, right? They are in the abstract. They're not connected in that fashion to the physical world. You can implement the bits however many you want. There's many different physical implementation. And that, of course, bothered who? Physicists. They say, is that really true? Is physics and information really unrelated? And Rolf Landauer, among others, started exploring that question for quite a long time. What is the relationship between physics and information? And there was a series, I'm not going to go into, of deep explorations of what is like the minimum unit of energy needed for computation, exploring things like, whether information processing is thermodynamically reversible, lots of very interesting physics idea. But pulling down that thread, Rolf Landauer hired a postdoc at the time who was at Harvard, Charlie Bennett. That's a picture of Charlie like now, not then. But he joined IBM Research and became really interested in this idea, and working with a few other collaborators, started looking specifically about the relationship between quantum physics and information. And this is a picture of his notebook of what I believe is the first time these words were written down, quantum information theory. And I won't go into details around that. It's just a little bit of a historical record around that. But it was the beginning of a journey of actually connecting the ideas of physics and information, and to really revisit whether Claude Shannon was right in separating physics and information so formally. The short answer to that question is not. It's actually physics and information related, and I'm gonna tell you about that in a second. But the consequences of this revisiting of that fundamental idea is culminating in what is now a branch in computing. This is the first time in history that the field of computing is creating a branch. And moving forward, what we have to realize is we will have classical computers, all the things we know and love, the things I told you about, and we will have quantum computers. And it is the wrong thinking to say a quantum computer is just a faster computer. It's actually, I'll show you, it's sometimes yes, sometimes no, but what it is a fundamentally different type of computer. And that is what is important to understand. Now you say, well, okay, that sounds very abstract, but what does it matter? What's the difference? As amazing as our computers are, and as many problems as we can solve with them, and it is many, if you look at it from a complexity theory perspective, they can only solve easy problems, in quotes, meaning problems for which the number of variables that you have to compute over does not grow exponentially. There are many classes of problems that we know for which that is not true. Famously, modeling the natural world. Because in modeling the natural world, the world of physics, right, and chemistry and so on, as we calculate the interactions of electrons and electron orbitals as they intersect with one another, even though we know the equations of physics, we cannot calculate it exactly beyond trivial problems or small-scale problems. And after that, we have to do approximations. And that's a tough problem for us. Sometimes the approximations are very good, but sometimes they're not. There's also mathematical problems for which this compute also has an exponential characteristic. And quantum is the only technology we know that alters the equation of some of those problems that are exponentially difficult, making them more tractable. Notice I'm not saying all problems. There will be classes of problems that neither these classical nor quantum computers we know how to solve exactly. But let me go back to this question of, is a quantum computer faster or slower than a classical computer? And I'm going to give you the answer that it depends. So let's take a simple example. Let's say multiply two numbers. P times Q gives you N. How long does it take to multiply a 2048-bit integer? In this example, a quantum computer is much, 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 much slower than a classical computer. Now, we're going to ask you the reverse problem. I give you the product where P and Q are prime numbers, and I give you a 2048 digit. And I says, give me the two prime numbers, give me P and Q, whose product is N. It turns out that a quantum computer, sufficiently advanced quantum computer, would be exponentially faster compared to a quantum computer, to a classical computer. So, and by the way, many of you will recognize that this is a very famous problem because this is how we do encryption. Encryption relies on the asymmetry of this problem. Because what we do, the way we secure information in financial markets, healthcare, national security, and so on, is that P and Q are your private keys. The product is the public key. And if you intercept the public key, which I send in an open channel, you cannot find P and Q because it's very hard to calculate. But if you have one of the numbers and the public key, it's trivial to calculate it. So one of the implications of quantum computing that I'm not going to go into, we can do in the Q&A if you want, is going to profoundly reshape the nature of encryption and how that happens. OK, so it does that exponentially faster. How does that happen? What are the powers that a quantum computer has? It has three powers of now tying the idea of physics and information. The power of superposition, interference, and entanglement. So superposition. So let's contrast now the two building blocks. Classical computers operate in the world of bits. Quantum computers operate in the world of qubits, quantum bits. The way to look at it is like, let's imagine it as a sphere for a second. So in the bit world, we have just two states, right? 0 and 1. And in a qubit world, we get to have combinations of zeros and 1. And let me unpack that a little bit to make it clear. So imagine that you have a sphere, and you put in the surface of that sphere is where you're going to represent your information. So let's say if it's in the North Pole, and I put a little sphere on the North Pole, that's a 0. If it's in the South Pole, it's a 1. If I put it in the equator, it will be half 0, half 1. But I could put it anywhere I want. Now, not only do I get to do that, is that in this representation, when I put one of my little spheres inside that larger sphere, the sphere can rotate like little moons. So I can actually get to have a phase with it. So here you're seeing a little bit of a rotation of that moon, right? You see a little bit of blue and a little bit of red. So in this case, I've rotated 180 degrees. So not only I have a 0, 1, now I have a 0 minus 1, right? So I can have combinations. I'm showing you just degrees of freedom that I have available in this representation. So the principle of superposition is that I can have any kind of combinations of those two states that I want. So for example, I can prepare a 0 state and a 1 state and create a 0 plus 1 state. I can also create, with this nifty trick of a rotation, of a phase rotation, a 0, 1 state where the 1 state is 180 degrees rotated. Right? So I have this tool, these mathematical tools that allow me to create this. And then I'll show you in a minute like how we implement them physically. So that's superposition. That's straightforward. Right? You can have combinations of states. Interference is the process that we're all familiar, like waves in the ocean, where you can constructively sort of add the amplitude and phase of a wave so that you form a peak, or you can cancel it and you can form a trough. So interference we also use in quantum information. And the trick we get to do is that unlike in classical systems, in a quantum system, if I have a 0, 1 state and a 0 minus 1 state, and I add them, I get a 0 state. I get to cancel information. So that's very interesting, right? Now I have a second powerful lever around that. But that's not even the most fundamental one. The most powerful one of this combination is the principle of entanglement. That is an inherently quantum mechanical phenomenon. And it basically says to us in quantum world that in quantum computing that the state of entangled qubits cannot be described independently of one another. Now, the root of this is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, it goes its origin to Heisenberg, right, and the uncertainty principle. And we've known since then that we cannot know both the position and the speed of a particle with arbitrary precision, right? That there's a trade-off inherent in knowing one of those two states. So the very famous thought experiment, right, that we get to explore in quantum computing is that if you create two particles that you entangle with one another, which by the way we are going to do at scale with our qubits, we're going to entangle the qubits with one another. If you do that, and in this thought experiment, you create these entangled particles and you separate them very far away, right? In the famous thought experiment, you could separate them to two ends of the universe. And you look at one particle alone. The particle itself is in a definite state. However, as it is, when you look at it, it looks individually random. However, and this is the equivalent of that, a gross analogy around that. Let's say you have a coin instead of a bits, or your qubit, is you're rotating the coin. In what state is the coin? Heads or tails? Not yet, right? When I perform the measurement, I'll end up in a definitive state, right? So at the beginning it looks random. But when I do the measurement, it's in either heads or tails, right? So same idea with an independent particle. However, if they're entangled, then when I measure one, let's say the position of or speed of the left particle, I immediately know the position or speed of the other particle, even if they're very far apart. So again, sort of in this gross analogy, if I have now two coins, in classical world, we know that if we spin them and we perform a measurement, the probabilities of heads and tails are independent of one another, right? But in quantum world, if they were entangled with one another, when I do the measurement, they're not independent. So we would be in situations where one is head, the other one is always head, or one is tails, the other one is always tails, and so on. Now this is very counterintuitive, right? And since the very beginning, a lot of people cried for Einstein famously did not like the idea, right? That's the whole statement of God doesn't play dice and many things and spooky action at a distance and so on. So I'm not going to unpack the whole story around that, but suffice it to say there's strong evidence that the world behaves in this manner and that a quantum mechanical representation of the world is much more complex than everyday experience tells us. But I want to just connect it to the idea of information. So it turns out that if you are actually able to create these qubits, like I told you, and you entangle them with one another, right, through a physical mechanism, you can actually represent a prodigious amount of states. So how many? So let's say I have 100 qubits. And let's just say for the sake of argument that they're perfect qubits, which they're not, but let's just say. So I have 2 to the 100 states available to me that are entangled. To be able to describe all the states using bits, I would need to devote every atom of planet Earth to store zeros and ones. By the time I have more than 280 qubits, I would need every atom of the known universe to store zeros and ones. So you have this very powerful exponential present. A way to describe the same idea is that to make a computer, a classical computer, twice as powerful, I have to have twice the number of transistors, twice the number of bits, essentially. In quantum world, the power is 2 to the n, where n is the number of qubits. So to double the power of my computer, I need to add one more qubit. So there's an exponential inherently present because of the way I'm encoding and representing information through entanglement. So now you have the building blocks to understand what an algorithm does. So this is how it works. The way an algorithm works in quantum land is that the first thing you do is you put your computer in all the available states. So let's say I have only 2 qubits, 2 to the power 2 is 4, so I have only 4 states, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1 state. If I have more, I have more states. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing is I put data in the computer that I want to compute over. That means, in practice, changing the phase of my states that are in that surface. Remember those little moons? I get to rotate that and change it. And the art of writing an algorithm is to take those states that have the phase encoding the data that you want to compute over and interfere them with one another like waves in the ocean, such that the right answer is maximized and the answers I don't care about get canceled out. Totally different than how we do classical information, right? We have our gates, or ands, and ors, and nots, and so on, that we process sequentially to do the computation. In quantum world, we also have gates. But some of the gates are more than the classical worlds. We have things like, hey, entangle each other, and things like that that we don't get to do efficiently in classical world. But in the end, way, way down in the stack, there is a circuit. There is the equivalent in classical world of an assembly language with a set of gates. And it looks like this, where that is, like it allows you to entangle things with one another. Each row here are qubits. And the sequence of gates is a program that you run. So the computer itself is the machine that allows you to sit on a classical computer. You write your code. You press go. You send zeros and ones over the internet. And then when they get to the computer, we use superconducting technology, so we actually convert those into little microwave pulses, about 5 gigahertz, that travel down a cryostat that works at cryogenic temperatures and actually exquisitely controls the state of each qubit, which in our case we use a transmon qubit. It's a form of Josephson junction that allows us to create the superposition, entanglement, and interference operations that is the hallmark of quantum computing. And these things are real machines. They physically, the first generation of systems that we created look like that. And this is a glass enclosure with the machine around it. I'll show you what looks inside. And in May 2016, we were the first company in the world to put a small quantum computer on the cloud. It had 5 qubits. And it allowed you to do exactly that. To do your programming, you send it over, it did all that thing, and it returned you an answer. This is what actually that looked like. You recognize here the gates, like you had a drag and drop system with gates. You press go, kind of like your hello world example of a quantum computer. And since then, we've been building together a global community of researchers, of developers, of enthusiasts all over the world that were interested in learning this new journey. And year after year, we've been building better and better quantum computers. We have built 80 quantum computers since then, right? And I'll show you some of the latest around that. In fact, now there's over 700 courses all over the world that use Qiskit, is the programming language to be able to do this. There's 9 million learners online. There's close to 3,000 scientific publications that use IBM quantum systems to do their work. So it's a growing, nascent community. It's kind of like, the world of deep learning in like maybe 2010 or something, or 2005, right? Where is the beginning of that journey. So where are we going next in quantum computing? Well, where we're going next is we want to create the first generation of quantum-centric supercomputers. And I want to give you like a reason for that. So we have seen CPU-centric supercomputers, many decades we built them. We're now seeing GPU-centric supercomputers, and we're most definitely going to see quantum-centric supercomputers. And the way that that's going to work is we're going to put a large amount of quantum processors and a very large amount of classical processors working in concert with one another. So you're going to write your program in your favorite programming language. You're not going to need to know a new programming language. You'll write in Python. Whatever you want is your favorite around that. And once you write your program, there are going to be libraries. And those libraries are going to call specialized architectures around that. If it calls in the library a quantum system, the system will automatically generate the circuit that you want, implementing all of those gates that I told you about, and actually use a lot of classical computer to actually break that circuit into chunks. And there'll be many quantum processors running in parallel that will execute different elements of that circuit. And then we will use a lot of classical compute to compile it again, to reconstruct the results of each individual circuit, and then give the answer back to the user. So don't think of a world where there's like a quantum computer, you send the thing and gives you the answer. That future is going to be many quantum processors and many, many classical processors working in concert as one unified system. We so much believe that idea that we've built now the platform that is going to allow us to do that. This is an actual video, this is not a rendering, of IBM Quantum System 2, the next generation of modular quantum computers that allows us now to scale out and build a quantum supercomputer. It's much, much larger than that Quantum System 1. It allows us to actually have inside, I'll show you now, multiple quantum processors inside a single cryostat. The processor itself operates at 15 millikelvin, very close to absolute zero. It's actually one of the coldest places in the universe is the bottom of a quantum computer. And in here, we have multiple of these quantum processors, all in a single cryostat. And then we're going to have many cryostats connected to one another, and that's where the fields of quantum computing and quantum communication are going to begin connecting with one another. And the way that's going to work is as follows. You're going to have a processor. Let's say this is our Heron processor that actually now implements multi-layer wiring so that we can implement, which I'm not going to touch on today, error correction at scale, which is a huge other topic on the world of quantum, but that's a different talk. And in this world of quantum processors, now all these processors have to be connected to one another, but remember, they have to be entangled with one another. So I have to pass quantum information through a quantum channel to different processors, not only within qubits within a chip, but also chip to chip, which you're seeing here. So for example, some of those qubits could be 2-qubit pairs that are entangled with one another. But I also need to connect them from cryostat to cryostat. So I have 3 types of quantum information channels. A very short distance within a chip, chip to chip, a few millimeters apart, and then things that maybe are like half a meter to a meter apart. So all of those things have to be quantum channels for us to be able to scale a quantum supercomputer, which we are doing. The implication of all of this is that we have seen a lot of the advancements that have been made possible of digital for the world of digital. But imagine now unlocking and unpacking the power of all of this computing to deal with the physical world as well. To deal with being able to create better fertilizers that are much more energy efficient, right, to feed a growing population. To be able to create new catalysts for industrial processes. To be able to actually understand new insights, right, in the world of high energy physics. To create novel and future battery technology. These are all areas in which it requires us to calculate and model and understand the material and physical world. And lighter and stronger alloys that we can use in planes. Or new classes of antibiotics, right, to counter the increasing resistance to antibiotic treatments that we're encountering, right, and we're facing. So this is the story that is unfolding. It is this world of bits, neurons, and qubits, right, that is going to combine, and we're living this decade, the opportunity not only to build these technologies, but to combine them and unleash them to actually solve problems that we could not solve before. And I'll close with this thought because sometimes when you see all this technology, it can seem overwhelming or scary and so on. But I always remind ourselves that technology in the end is a tool. And look around, but I don't think we've run out of problems to solve in the world. And we could use the help. So anything that we can also do, guided by the principles that we care about in our society, to assist us to solve problems faster than we're creating them, is a good vector to pursue. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I think we have time for some questions, if you have any. Okay, please. I don't know if there's a microphone, or I'll repeat the question. I think there's a microphone coming.
Hello, my name's Gianangelo. I was wondering what metrics you use for quantum computers as opposed to classical computers, because you said they're fundamentally different, so you probably don't use the same metrics.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So before, I would separate before fault tolerance and after the world of fault tolerance. In fault tolerance, the only market I'm giving is the ability to implement error corrections. One of the challenges that we have in quantum computers, they're also present in classical computers, is dealing with errors. The errors come from the fact that the energy from the outside world, outside my computer, couples itself to the computer and makes the system decohere. So one metric you have, for example, is the coherence time. What is the window of time with which you get to execute your circuit before it decoheres and the qubits become just bits, essentially, around that? Even more important than that is because it always requires the fundamental unit of operation is a 2-qubit pair, it is the error rate present in that 2-qubit operation. That's known as the fidelity of the system. And to give you a sense, for superconducting technologies, there's different ways to implement quantum computers. You can do it with ions and photons and so on. But we use for superconducting, a big important threshold that we gotta get over is to get about 10 to the minus 4 error rates, right, at scale. So that's another very important metric around that. But to answer very broadly is the key engineering balance that you gotta get to build a good quantum computer is quantity, quality, and speed. Quantity, how many qubits can you operate, right? Like, your ability to fabricate them and scale. Eventually you need hundreds of thousands and so on, or millions of them. The quality of it, which is this 2-qubit error rate, like what is coherence and the fidelity around that, how well can you do that? And the speed, how fast can you execute a circuit? And it is the balance of those three things that determines your ability to build a good quantum computer. Here in the front, there are two.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the economics of quantum computers? Because it's a little bit of a black box.
Yeah. So compared to what is the first question around that, right? So if you look at, for example, a supercomputer, right, an example. So today, a supercomputer are projects that range anywhere between few hundred million to many billions of dollars. But let me give you an outer bound of this. Projects like are being contemplated today in AI, where people are saying, let's create a 1 gigawatt data center. If you look at the cost of that project and you fill it to the top with like NVIDIA chips and so on and the power, that's a $50 billion project. So we used to be very impressed with numbers like a national supercomputing project, like Summit, Sierra, Frontera, and so on, that were like billion-dollar projects, or Fugaku in Japan, right? It was like billion and a half projects. But now the scale of what's possible around us, so that's compared to what nowadays. So those can be massive. So for certain classes of problems, the comparison is going to be, obviously a quantum-centric supercomputer will be a large project, right? I mean, at that scale, it's probably on the billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar thing. Today, machines, obviously, when we deploy them in systems around the world, are much, much cheaper than that, right? I mean, much smaller, but they're not like $10,000 either, right? They're like, many, many, many millions of dollars. But a large-scale project is going to be in that territory. But the thing is, you got to compare it to the energy efficiency in solving that problem with a different way. And that's where it's going to shine tremendously. Because remember that exponential. For certain classes of problem, the cost of doing the other way is you're following some exponential curve. And that exponential is going to be driven by dollars and energy, right? Or, I mean, however you want to substitute one for the other. So it's going to be vastly more economical, I mean, by orders of magnitude for certain classes of problems. But they're not going to be, I don't think quantum computers are going to be things we have in our homes, right? Or there's no equivalent of like a laptop for a quantum computer. They're going to be things that are in a data center, that are sophisticated, large-scale things. We may benefit directly from that, but it's going to be kind of like a cloud access, or you compute and we benefit from the calculation that they compute and things, and you end up with a better battery or something like that. But there'll be sort of large-scale, expensive, in quote, computers. But I used to think what was expensive. I'm recalibrating what's expensive nowadays.
Thank you.
I think you were there. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned deep neural networks and how they can basically, at some point, encode all the information that we have in documents or images in whatever form. When we prompt such an LLM, do you believe it's sampling from the information base that we provide, kind of similar to how we recall something from memory? Or do you believe it can begin to reason about our universe, laws of physics, and can begin to infer things? And basically what I'm trying to say is, can it reason with logic, or is it just memorizing? And how do we actually even assess that in the first place? Thank you.
That's a very hot topic, right, around that. And I think there is strong evidence that you can do some reasoning around that. And some of it is quite sophisticated. But it's not all the kind of reasoning and all the types of reasoning that we care about. So, but I think we would be hard-pressed to say that, in the grand classical sort of field in AI of learning and reasoning, right, and logic and symbol manipulation versus the world neural networks, I think to say that LLMs you cannot engage in reasoning right now is too strong a statement. But it's incomplete. It's not enough. And therefore, the way you see nowadays these LLMs is not really anymore an LLM alone, right? There are many tools, right? There are complex engineering systems of which one or multiple LLMs and many other function calling and logic tools are part of the overall equation to compensate for that very limitation. But even if you took an LLM alone, right, just raw LLM with sufficient scale, you can engage in some things that we would recognize as reasoning. And you can do that by saying, hey, describe the problem in a sequence of steps and so on. So there's tricks and clever things that you can do to do something that feels to us like you're engaging in a reasoning process around that. But it's not, but this is always like religious debates, It's like there's a whole world around that. People have very strong views around these things, so I'm sure there's lots of traps to fall over. But anyway, I'm giving you a more sort of engineer version around that. My view is that even within my teams around that, like I try not to follow religious dogma, right, all on these things, right, and see experientially what's possible. I think on the back and in the front here, there's a few questions. Yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. Here.
Where are we? Oh, over here. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. In LLMs now, these days, there is a big drive to put automated reasoning to accommodate for some of their shortcomings. Through your talk, you described the exponential nature of information and how things increase. And in the end, with quantum computing, you also showed that there is a potential to store massive amounts of information with little qubits and do massive calculations. How would you say that AI and quantum computing would merge together? Do you see it as a direct replacement, as a storage, as an additional computational component?
Yeah.
Or would it also provide us novel opportunities for calculation?
Yeah. Okay, so let me parse it a bit. I think that question is something we're really interested and fascinated, and we're putting a lot of energy looking at the arrows in both directions. What can AI do for quantum, which is a lot, namely, for example, in automated programming, improving the circuits that get written. So we envision a future where we're going to help people more and more dealing with a lot of this complexity assisted by AI. So we're bringing lots of AI in the quantum itself, but also in the other direction. What can quantum do for AI? And that's a very sort of novel and interesting field of research around, and I'll point you, I'll be happy to send some recent papers that the team have published around the equivalent of quantum supervector machines, like quantum kernels, like novel ways, like to actually be able to create the measurement of distances of kernels that is present in a lot of classical AI, but expressed in the world on quantum in novel ways that are totally different. It's not about taking a classical, the wrong way to program a quantum computer is to take a classical algorithm and says run on the quantum computer. You gotta rewrite it, exploiting in intrinsic properties. So that's a nascent field that is happening, and the aspirations that we have is that in the overall pipeline of how you do AI, there'll be certain elements in that pipeline, just like you're talking about tools and different things, where part of that pipeline could incorporate quantum computing as part of it. But it's not going to be as direct as saying, it's just like another generation of GPUs, and once I have it, I run what I have, and it runs on a quantum computer. That's not going to work, right? So that's a partial answer. And one more sort of nuance in terms of the exponential representation of information is that actually a quantum computer is not a big data machine, meaning what quantum excels at is if you have a relatively modest amount of information coming in, but the number of states that you gotta compute over is very large. And then you perform a measurement and have relatively amount of data coming out. So the intermediate representation is huge in the number of states, but the input and the output is relatively small, I mean, not tiny, but small, compared to what we're used nowadays with, say, GPU farm and so on. So it's not really like a big data machine. So you have to sort of use what each one gives you. And there's no, and also on the memory thing, for complicated reasons, quantum memories are not like, there's a lot of issues. You cannot clone the state of the information that is present in the quantum information and so on. So you can only live while it is being computed over, and then you measure and it's gone. Over there.
Hello. Yeah. So it's been a pleasure attending the lecture so far. The question that I have is, what are your views regarding photonics for development of quantum computers?
Yeah, so I should have mentioned, and obviously there was already a lot of content. There's many ways to build quantum computers, as I mentioned. Photonics is an example of that. There's a lot of interest in that. I am very strong supported of seeing a quantum industry emerge, and that we see a whole variety of approaches. I mentioned also that I'm very interested in the intersection of computing and communications, right, and around that. But if you ask me then to answer your question directly we've placed our bet. We believe very strongly that supercomputing devices on the balance of engineering of quantity, quality, and speed have the right trade-off balance to be able to get there. But my encouragement is to let people compete,
Thank you.
Oh, please.
Could you address the role of computer, to see that particularly in the case of unmet medical need, in the case of cancer, what you posted?
Well, I think that, the question was what is the role of computing or computers in addressing medical needs, for example, cancer and so on. Look, I think that this intersection of the world of biology and the life sciences and because they are information processing machines, right? Also, there's a way to look at them as information systems. And be able to bring and unlock the full power of all these computational techniques to that as one of the most transformative things that are going to happen in the coming decades. The inhibitors to that, and for example, we have a huge partnership with the Cleveland Clinic. Based on, it's called the Accelerated Discovery Institute there, where we're bringing the best of high-performance computing, the best of AI, and the best of quantum to look into exactly these problems. That means the inhibitors is we need to collaborate across disciplines, which is not easy, right? Because everybody has a different language and a different way to look at it, a different training. So there's a cultural element of how we work with each other. And then there's another issue that is the regulatory element of it. That, frankly speaking, there's good reasons for why that exists, but it is also a challenge in bringing many of these technologies at the pace with which we could make a difference. So, caveat those two aspects of how do we bring languages and culture and work with each other on shared problems, and the regulatory constraint of how and when you can use certain technologies to do what, and at what speed we can bring things to market. If we could unlock those two things, I think it's probably one of the most transformative things we can do to impact societies, bringing these two worlds together.
Maybe one other question?
Sure. You pick. As the head of the institution, you get to choose the last one.
Okay, the lady in front of Dr. Libera. Yes, your hand is up. You want to stand up? Yes. Did I do all right?
It's perfect. It sounds great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think my questions are around like the classes of problems and how they're impacted. So, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
We can hear you.
So, for example, like I'm wondering, you'd mentioned classical computers in certain cases are faster or more reliable, or I'm kind of inferring that. So I'm almost wondering, do you imagine that like a set of problems go to one, a set of problems go to the other? You know what I mean? Almost like a load balancing or a...
Yes.
And I guess relatedly, I wonder about specific classes of problem or approaches like recursion. I mean, is this just way better for that kind of approach? I'm also a little worried about like NP complete. Does this totally break all of that?
Yeah, so the way I envision, it's actually 1B, like this all goes here, all goes there. Mm-hmm. The way I envision is like in your program, there will be libraries, right, and certain function calls that are gonna be routed to specialized hardware. Some libraries are well optimized to run CPU. Some libraries, like, in today's world, the world of CUDA, and with Open Triton, right, like, other environments. But basically, you would implement that natively on GPUs, and there'll be different providers of GPUs or neural accelerators. And then say, for example, there'll be functions, which we've released recently in Qiskit as an example, that allows you, when that gets called, for example, give me an estimation, right, or give me a sampler from a quantum processor. So as the program gets executed, you'll be calling functions, and each function is going to trigger specialized types of computing, and then that information is going to get processed and integrated back. Mm-hmm. So when the program completes, you would have called upon a variety of processing environments to give you the answer. I think that that's what the future is going to end up looking like, right? Is sort of this blend of partitioning of problems.
And what about NP complete? Are we totally breaking that?
So not generally, right? I didn't claim that quantum computers solve all NP complete problems. I think there'll be classes of problems. There are many complexity classes, of which NP is just one of them, right around that. There are many problems of different complexity. I mean, in NP complete, for example, for those in the audience, it's a very hard problem. I mean, it's an exponential problem. But if you have the answer, it's very easy to verify. In quantum world, there are problems that have the same attribute. They're very hard to compute, and they're very hard to verify that you even have the right answer. How do you know that you have the right answer, right? So in quantum, there'll be many opportunities of classes of problems on both NP class and others that actually we can make a difference. And there'll be some others on that complexity class that we cannot solve efficiently.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel guilty that the young lady who stood up couldn't ask her question. Do you mind if
Please.
we take one more? Thank you. So I'm pointing at this young lady, and I don't want to go anywhere else. Yes.
It's okay. Actually, I was going to ask something very similar about, like, you mentioned that the future is going to be implementing, like, just calling these functions that are already translated. And yeah, I was wondering if that's going to be like open source, or, well, you clarified part of my question, but is that going to be kind of like open source, or someone's going to offer these translated libraries to quantum computing? And like, if that's already started, because I guess the translation is going to be like a little
Hard,
bit
yeah.
difficult. Yeah.
So the answer is both. This Qiskit itself is an open source project where many people are contributing to this all over the world, right? So that's happening in open source. But there's a thriving ecosystem of startups that are creating their own functions and algorithms. And recently we announced something called Qiskit Functions that has brought many companies, many startups, Q-Control, Algorithmic, and so on, Kedma, many others, where they have proprietary software, like they've come up with a clever algorithm to do things from error mitigation or sampling or so on. And they say, hey, I want to make it available like a piece of software that you can call upon and integrate. So like modern day software, you're going to have a combination of open source packages, and you're going to have proprietary software that companies make, but they're going to be available, and you're going to be able to integrate into a normal program. So very much like today's software, right? Is going to feel very similar to that.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Gill, thank you very much. I'm sorry. Thank you. I was going to ask for another round of applause, but the audience beat me to it.
They were ahead of you on there.
They went ahead of me, which is perfectly fine. But I wanted to say that your presentation was really nothing short of fascinating. It was extremely informative, thought-provoking, and as president of this university, I am very proud of you as an alumnus. Congratulations and great job.
Thank you. Thank you.
For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to ask your questions, there is going to be a reception, and I would invite you, and Dr. Gill will be there, and I would invite you to join us at the reception and surround him with your questions, but allow him to breathe a little bit. I have two other small things to do before we wrap up this session. First, I'm pleased to confer the 9th President's Medal today upon Dr. Gill. Wow. The medal is standing or sitting here, and I will open it and I will confer it upon you in a moment. But I'm going to say what this medal is all about. The President's Medal is awarded to individuals who have had a significant impact on society by virtue of their science and technology-focused research and development activities and contributions, their entrepreneurial accomplishments, their leadership in business education or the public sector, their artistic or cultural contributions, or their success in elucidating critical topics for greater public understanding, policymaking, and action. And you have done not one, but many of these. Today, I bestow this honor upon Dr. Gill for his leadership and significant contributions to the field of computer science. As further tribute to Dr. Gill's influence, this might be a surprise to you, a deserving and talented incoming first-year student will be selected to receive a scholarship in the name of Dr. Darío Gill starting next fall.
Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, do we have a photographer here? All right. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to put this around your neck.
All right.
You can take a photo. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Gill, again, and please join us upstairs for the reception. Thanks a million.
Thank you. Thank you all. And
This was fantastic.